Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, January 18th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined back in the studio here by John Walters. John Walters is a blogger who publishes the Vermont Political Observer and has reported and written for both 7 Days and VT Digger. He's also been a working reporter in Michigan and New Hampshire as well as in Vermont. We're really glad to have him back here to help bring us up to speed on what's going on up in the legislature and other things besides. So, John, just to kind of get us started here, I was thinking, tell us a little bit about the world of blogging. How is it different from sort of being a beat reporter or a columnist as you've been in the past?
Well, you are responsible to no one except yourself, and so that gives me a lot of freedom. It allows me to put out, well, it allows me to have a point of view for one thing, and to put out stories that might not, that I am satisfied are worth reporting, but might not pass the rigors of a fact-checking system. You know, I just put out a story earlier this week about the Ethan Allen Institute and changes at the top there. And I got a lot of my information from one source. And it seemed a reliable source, and I thought it passed muster, so I wrote it up and put it out there in the world. And sometimes that means I make mistakes, and I try to correct them when they come to my attention. I've had to retract 2 or 3 articles in my almost 10 years of blogging. But you know, the fact that I'm seen by people in the political and media fields as, you know, worth reading, I guess justifies my existence. But because of my time blogging, I know a lot of people in Vermont politics, and they quite often reach out to me with information. So it's fun. It keeps me going in what otherwise would be, I don't know, looking for something to do in retirement, I guess.
All right, well, I'll keep that in mind. Yeah, maybe there's a second act here in all of this. But so do you choose your topics then by just sort of whatever is kind of going on and what seems to be of interest at the time?
Something that hits me in the news, something that, like I said, comes to my attention, just sort of something that will strike me. You know, I recently wrote a piece about the healthcare system in which I basically said, what healthcare system? You know, it's not a system, it's this sort of like Rube Goldberg contraption that kind of works and kind of doesn't. You know, it's badly in need of reform, and I kind of like, I used Pierre Trudeau's bold metaphor about Canada and the US. You know, it's like a mouse in bed with an elephant. And even if the elephant is well-intentioned, the mouse doesn't really sleep well. And that's kind of how I feel about the healthcare system. It's all insurance companies and drug companies and all sorts of institutions and corporations that can, you know, change their policies, you know, impose new costs, and we're kind of at the mercy of all of that. You know, they talk about the problems of having a government-run healthcare system, but right now it's run by a bunch of different organizations that are as big and soulless as governments. So take your pick, I guess. So that was just something that didn't really come out of the news, but it just was something that a bunch of different things kind of fed into that, and I was inspired, so I wrote.
Well, it must be great to be able to be your own editor and write what you think is important and, you know, just put it out there as opposed to thinking back to, you know, well, somebody else is going to read this and we're going to change that and we're going to move this around and all of that. But you can just craft your story the way you want it to go.
Yeah, and you know, that causes its own problems, but you know, I enjoy it, and I'm a good enough writer that I get away with it almost all the time. So, and you know, people read me. I even started taking donations through my blog site, and a lot of people have stepped up and given money either once or become like monthly contributors, which it's not paying the rent, but it's a nice feeling that people value what I'm doing.
Well, let's have a peek then at what you're following in Vermont politics these days. I mean, the timing of your appearance here is perfect. The legislature just got restarted, starting a new biennium as well as a new session. So what are some of the areas or issues that you think the legislature is going to be taking up that you're going to be following closely?
Well, I mean, there's sort of an overarching theme, which is, Governor Phil Scott kind of versus the legislature. The governor, for all his geniality, has racked up a record number of vetoes, and it's looking very much like we might have another healthy crop this year. The governor came out of the election rightfully believing he had a mandate. The Democrats came out of the election with historic majorities. They believe they have a mandate, and their voters expect them to take action. So there are a bunch of issues on which the governor has made it clear where he stands and what he's willing to accept and not, on things like climate change and paid family leave, child care expansion. Whatever happens with the budget, that's usually contentious. The governor has some very strong ideas on where he wants to spend money and where he doesn't think it's worth spending money, and I think the legislature is in some degree not going to go along with that. So there are a number of big issues where it seems like they're on a collision course. The Democrats have veto-proof majorities in the House and Senate, but that's not a guarantee. If you have, 23 votes in the Senate, they better all be there, and they better all be on board. And sometimes, some of the more moderate lawmakers are not on board. The clean heat standard lost by 1 vote last year on a veto override. So they've got a little more margin for error now, but every veto override vote is a strenuous exercise. And I think the Democrats would like to choose their fights to the extent that they can. But that's the big thing shaping up, is the two sides who have butted heads quite often in the past may do so even more in 2023.
Well, both the legislators and the governor seem to be saying, after the election anyway, if my memory serves correctly, that this coming year, the session that we're now in, they were going to be more consultative. They were, when a bill reached the governor's desk, it was going to be because both sides had plenty of opportunities to say, well, we're okay with this, we're not okay with that, how can we find the middle ground, blah, blah, blah. And so it seemed to be they were trying to strike this tone of more collaborative working together, and we weren't going to have a record number of vetoes again. Not your sense that that's going to be the way it's going to play out?
Well, the governor delivered his inaugural address at the opening of the legislature a couple of weeks ago now, and his tone was collaborative and genial, as he always is, but he made it clear on a number of issues that he has a position and he's pretty much sticking to it. His close was that he urged us to all work together for the good of Vermont, but the legislature in the past has said that he doesn't do that, at least not often enough and not reliably enough. And there have been cases where there have been vetoes over issues that seem relatively minor. They're important enough to the governor, but it would have seemed like he could have worked something out if he had tried a little harder. I would hope that the fact that they both clearly have their own mandates would kind of force them to work together. I guess I'll believe that when I see it, but we live in hope.
How do you explain the fact that the legislature now is a supermajority of Democrats, progressives, independents, and Governor Phil Scott won re-election for a 4th term by a crushing majority?
It was like almost 4 to 1.
70%.
Yeah.
I think it was the biggest margin of victory in any of his races so far.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess on the one hand you could say, well, that just goes to show that folks in Vermont have a, a very nuanced view of all of that, and kind of, vote in the person, not the party. But it is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think, Phil Scott is a very appealing person. I've often said that, he would be the best neighbor you could possibly have, because if you needed help, he'd be right there. And he'd know how to do things.
He'd be able to fix your whatever was not working right.
Yeah, so, and, he has been at least a competent manager of state government. There haven't been any big blow-ups. And, couldn't say the same about Peter Shumlin, so in some regards, Phil Scott is kind of a comfy chair after a rough ride. And I think a lot of Vermonters do like to see themselves as nonpartisan. I think a lot of Vermonters don't want the Democratic legislature to have unfettered control. Phil Scott is kind of a brake on their more progressive tendencies. And I think a lot of people are comfortable with that. And, he got us through the pandemic. Whatever you can say about the details of what he did and where he might have done better, he got us through. And he got us through better than almost any other governor in the country. So that's to his credit. And I think a lot of people just see him as a reliable, no-nonsense Vermonter who has their best interests at heart. I think he can kind of probably be governor as long as he wants to. I just don't know how much longer he'll want to. Most governors kind of get tired of it after he's in his 4th term now. And not very many governors go more than 4 terms. So it'll be interesting to see what he does in 2024, but that's a long way off.
Right, yeah, no kidding. Yeah, just trying to think, Howard Dean served 5 terms, if memory serves.
Well, he became governor upon the death of Richard Snelling,
Right.
so I don't know if he ran 5 times or if he served 5 terms. But anyway, yeah, Jim Douglas served 4 and got out. Peter Shumlin couldn't even get to 4. It's rare for a governor to lose 1st or 2nd time around if they run for re-election, but it's not very often that you see them go for as long as 10 years.
Right.
We'll see. I think Phil Scott feels the weight of being the only Republican in the building, and if he decides to retire, there is no obvious Republican to step forward and maybe hold the governorship. There's probably some sense of extra responsibility that comes with that.
Yeah, indeed. It just seems like the Republican bench is pretty thin at this point.
And the Republican Party is horribly disorganized and underfunded, and really in the thrall of the very far right. Their other statewide candidates were not competitive. They ran a lot of people in the legislature who were very far right. Some of whom right here in this neck of the woods, Joe Gervais was one of those. Many of them tried to present themselves as sort of mainstream conservatives, but their positions leaked out here and there. Anyway, that's to say that the Republican Party doesn't even have really a recruitment or organizational process in place because they're so badly underfunded. They don't have any staff. They have a volunteer chair, and that's about all they've got in terms of an office, running an office, trying to coordinate a party. So some people who might be moderate hopefuls have kind of backed away because they see no prospect for being able to compete with the Democrats, even if they're an acceptably moderate Republican, because they just don't have any party backing, and in fact, the party might reject them outright, as they did with the U.S. Senate election last year, where Christina Nolan was kind of the choice of mainstream Republicanism, and she couldn't win the primary. And then the one who did win the primary, Gerald Malloy, was far too conservative for the electorate, and he lost. So that's where the Republicans are, and that's one of the reasons why the Democrats, Phil Scott is the unicorn. He came up before this Republican Party morphed. He has more than 20 years in politics, so people know him, and they have a really strong sense of who he is, and they trust him and they like him. It's going to be really hard for a Republican to kind of come out of nowhere and build that kind of credibility with the voters.
I know this is an area you covered extensively last fall in your post. You were, profiling a lot of the Republican candidates who were kind of
Yes.
straddling the fence. I'm not sure what the right word.
One of whom with a picture from one of your candidate forums.
Right. Well, anyway, I wanted to ask you just to kind of get back into the journalism side of things. One of the things that happened since the pandemic, took hold in the State House was that meetings in the State House in the committee rooms, which, as we both know, are
Tiny.
small little rooms. They're
Yep.
a little bit larger than the size of this table, but not a whole lot, and jammed with staff and lobbyists and other folks, as well as the representatives. So a lot of folks who were following the legislature on live streams or YouTube.
Well, for a couple of years, they were just doing everything via Zoom. This year, they're back in the legislature, but that has presented problems.
Right. Because now some journalists are being restricted from being able to sit in and watch those meetings, and I'm sure, as we both know, there's a lot of nuance that happens just from sitting in the room that you simply don't get on a live stream.
I mean, Zoom, at least everybody was on the same footing. Everybody was in a little box on the screen or watching a bunch of little boxes. It's much harder to follow a committee discussion when they're all in a room together, because some of them mumble, some of them talk over each other. The cameras don't catch everything. If there is a visual presentation, like a PowerPoint presentation, they'll put that on the video screen instead of the committee hearing, which is valuable if you want to read the text, but then you can't see who's talking. So it really is a situation that they're going to need to make accommodations somehow so that the press can get into meetings that they want to get into. It's always been tough, and now it's even tougher because I'm sure they have restrictions on the number of people who can go into a given room, and there are always clouds of lobbyists who want to get in there. So, the press has sent a very strongly worded letter to the leaders of the House and Senate, basically saying that they need to make better accommodation for reporters, and they should.
Well, yeah. Otherwise, hey, who knows what's going on? I mean, I was thinking, couldn't they have some of the committee meetings in some of those caucus rooms down on the main floor? Or there are some rooms in there that are a little bit larger than the size of this table, but where at least some meetings could be held, and maybe they could schedule them in such a way that everybody has their turn.
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard to predict very far in advance which hearings are going to attract a big crowd. Where are the reporters going to decide that they all need to be in this hearing that day? And there aren't that many big rooms in the State House. That's one thing. There's been talk for years of either building an addition on the State House, or maybe even building a new building and turning the State House into kind of a living museum. Because the committee rooms really are not big enough, and that was acceptable when the worst that could happen is you'd get a couple of colds every winter season from being in a room with so many people. But in the age of COVID, that's a little more problematic. But that's a long way off, if ever. And in the meantime, we've got these tiny rooms, and they're going to have to figure something out.
Yeah, and it's definitely understandable. Just to be clear, that the last couple of years when the pandemic was raging, that was certainly a very necessary decision to make. But maybe it's time to start thinking further. But well, anyway, just kind of following along with that. What do you've had a long background in journalism, public radio, as well as print. Been an awful lot of discussion about where the media is headed, the industry in general. Thinking back 15 or 20 years, we've seen the emergence of the internet and social media, and newsrooms being depopulated
Yes.
by reporters, jobs going away, newspapers closing completely. Particularly a lot of small-town papers have been either swallowed up by larger conglomerates and then closed or reduced. Any sense that there's some other future that potentially could be out there, or is this going to be a case where the industry is just going to be continuing to shrink and struggle?
Well, it's certainly hard to see a model to replace the old model where journalism was basically supported by advertising revenue. You know, back in the old days when you'd pick up a paper for, you know, a quarter or 50 cents or a nickel or whatever, depending on how far back you go, you know, that was maybe like a fifth of their revenue. The rest was all those huge ads from grocery stores and supermarkets and car dealerships, and a huge classified section which died when Craigslist came along. So, you know, media outlets are left with none of the online revenue streams come anywhere close to matching the physical world. And so, you know, we are fortunate to have one successful nonprofit model, VT Digger, which has become the dominant source for news about state government and politics and policy. But that's only one outlet, and even if it's a really good outlet, they can only do so much, and you're only getting one story. You know, I've been in and around the State House for 11 years now, and I remember, you know, the press corps used to be very crowded. I mean, the press gallery in the House, you'd have to elbow your way in to get a seat. You know, you didn't have Digger, but you had 7 Days, you had the Burlington Free Press, you had the Times-Argus and Rutland Herald, which had the Vermont Press Bureau, you had Vermont Public Radio, now Vermont Public, the TV stations. There were multiple reporters chasing the same story every day, and that would result in better coverage. They were competing with each other. You had different angles on the same story. You could compare, make your own decisions. And now, you know, Digger's kind of the only one left. You know, 7 Days is mostly doing Chittenden County. Free Press and the Times-Argus aren't doing state government, except very occasionally. The TV stations are still kind of around. Vermont Public is not there as much as they used to because, you know, they're making their own accommodations to the new world by spending more money on podcasting and doing more with their hourly newscasts than they used to, because the Associated Press is pretty much dried up and blown away. There used to be at least one reporter from the AP at the State House every day, and that's gone, pretty much gone. So it's hard to see where that quantity of coverage is going to come from. And if anything, it's easy to see, you know, news organizations taking more and more shortcuts and finding ways to kind of present at least the image of news without investing in staff and reporters and editors. You know, I think the quality of coverage is, I worry about it. You know, we were kind of chatting, setting up this program about artificial intelligence and the fact that now AI is capable of writing plausibly good stories and essays and poems and just about everything by, you know, taking in all of like literature and then being able to sort that out and reproduce something that looks like it. And I could see, you know, news organizations going to a lot of AI-produced content because it would be cheap and it would fill the space that they need to fill. And I worry about that because, you know, there kind of has to be a grounding in reality. You know, AI can agglomerate all this stuff and sort it all through, but there's, you know, what are the inputs? Right. So, you know, it's hard to see where we're going to get our news from. And just as one example of how this might make a difference is George Santos, the compulsive liar who's now a congressman. the local paper in his district, which is like, marginal operation, did run a story about his fabricating his resume, but it didn't really get anywhere before the election. And after the election, the New York Times wrote a big story about it, and that's when it blew up nationally in New York. But it was too late to prevent him from being elected. So, and there have been occasions in the recent past where news organizations have broken big stories in Vermont. News organizations that really don't exist anymore have been important sources of information. So it's hard to say what passes for State House coverage now is any sort of real check and balance, is any real like comprehensive watchdog. We're going to replace the watchdog with a robot dog, I guess. So it's hard to see where this is all going to go. We, again, live in hope, I guess.
Yeah, the whole artificial intelligence aspect and the GNAT-GPT program that just came out, last November, I think. I mean, the implications of all of that are just mind-boggling, and certainly something to kind of watch very carefully.
It'll be a while before they can, generate an AI and/or a McKeever.
Well, that probably won't be too hard. It'll be harder to replicate yours, believe me. But before we go, I just one last thought on some of this. The social media has also been a gigantic factor in news coverage and influencing the media. And it just seems like, particularly, we saw this, I guess, in the last couple of presidential elections, actually, where misinformation deliberately was put out there by groups for one reason or another, and went out on Facebook or other social media platforms, and kind of became part of the conversation and was kind of believed by some voters.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you see us ever getting control of that to the point where, that is reined in some way or another? I confess I'm very pessimistic about that.
I think it will be a perpetual struggle, and the terrain will be constantly changing. It was a few years ago where it became fairly easy to generate fake photographs and even fake videos. And now we've got fake stories and fake content. Ways will emerge, but part of this whole revolution is how balkanized we've all become. We all have our favorite sources of information that kind of reinforce our own beliefs and our prejudices. And if we are all in our own little bubble where, like, AI is driving content to you based on what you have read before and what videos you've watched before. So the AI is going to reinforce your own tendencies and, push it farther in that direction. And you're not going to get the old thing of, like, the evening news where you watch for 28 minutes and you get a little bit of everything, or the paper where you actually will see stories and read them that you wouldn't just think of as interesting. So it's just going to be a constant struggle, I think, where we are battling, technology and money and all of that stuff, and doing our best to, provide a little light here and there.
Well, it'll be interesting to see, I think.
Yes.
Anyway, well, we're going to have to leave it there, John. Unfortunately, I think we could talk for another 28 minutes or whatever, but the clock says it's time to go, as the old song says. But anyway, great to have you with us here, and
thank you.
Thanks again for making the trip down from up north to share your thinking with us. Been really great to have John Walters, who is a blogger who publishes the Vermont Political Observer. I'm sure you can Google that and find the link and go and read his stuff. It's really interesting. I get it in my email every day, and always worth a read. So thanks for being with us. Hope you've enjoyed our show, and we'll see you again the next time. Thanks again.